When it comes to tape measures, if you already know why this bit wobbles and there's a hole at the end and there's a measurement on the back of the case here, well done. You're not a tape measure novice, and you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to talk about any of those things today. Instead, I'm going to be talking about 6 new tips which I think will make your life easier and your cuts more accurate, and sometimes without even using a tape measure. You want to know some more? Keep watching. In the practical world of DIY or woodwork, metalwork, engineering, measurement is all important, or should I say the accuracy of measurement. It can mean the difference between a good project and a bad project, or even success and failure. And in a lot of our projects, we have things naturally introducing errors, like using natural materials, that anything like measurement that we can control, we really should, rather than compounding those problems. So let's start by looking at the one thing that we all use most of the time, and that's the simple tape measure. If you thought all tape measures were equal, you'd be wrong. One tape measure is not necessarily as accurate as the other. And it's easy to see that for yourself. Just lay out the tape measures that you own and put a straight edge between them, and you'll see that they don't all necessarily line up exactly with the same measurement. These 6 that I've laid out this morning, I've already had a look at, and can be up to a millimetre difference within the first metre. So how do we know how accurate our tape measures are? Well, here in the UK and Europe, we have 3 classes of tape measures. The worst class, class 3, is the type of thing that you might be given free with a company logo on. You have no way of telling how accurate it is or what it conforms to. Class 1 is the most accurate, which means that it's plus or minus 1.1 millimetres over a 10 metre stretch, but they're more specialised. Generally, the type we buy in the shops here are class 2, and that means that they're within plus or minus 2.3 millimetres over a 10 metre length. How do you know if you've got a class 2 tape measure? Well, just have a look in the first 100 or 200 mil. It will tell you, because it's got this 2 logo on it. It will also tell you what year it was manufactured in. M20 means 2020. So go and have a look at your own tape measure and see what class it is. You'll probably find out it's a class 2. They're the most popular, but most people would have never have seen that before. So what does this mean? This means that we can go and buy 2 new tape measures that are both undamaged, and over a metre or 2 start reading slightly different values. So this is going to cause us major problems if we're trying to get absolutely spot on. So there is a very easy way around this, and this is my top tip number 1. If you're building furniture or a door or something that you're trying to get absolutely accurate, before the start of the build, pick the tape measure you want to use, make sure it's undamaged, and stick with that one tape measure throughout that whole build. It may not be perfect, but at least it's going to be consistent throughout all your cuts and all your measurements. The last thing you want to be doing is halfway through picking up another tape measure and suddenly wondering why you've got half a millimetre adrift somewhere. So top tip number 1, pick a tape measure and stick with it. So I've got the tape of my choice, and I've got a nice sharp pencil, and I've got a piece of timber here that I want to cut nice and accurately, maybe down to 1/10 of a millimetre. How do I transfer a measurement on this as accurately as possible onto the timber and then get it cut for absolute accuracy? Well, there's a couple of things that I do all the time that I've never seen explained, so I'll just work through my thought process. First of all, a piece of timber like this is the end I'm keeping, this is the waste end, and this will be along the fence of my mitre saw. I know that when I pull down the blade of my mitre saw that it's going to be touching around about this area, which is a couple of inches from the fence. So the first thing I want to do is to mark at that point where the blade comes down, so I can line it up really accurately. I don't want to be marking over here when the blade comes down here. So that helps line things up when I put it into the saw. And secondly, and this is my top tip, that when I do make the mark, well, once I've done that, I don't just go over to the mitre saw and chop through the middle of the pencil mark. Before I do that, I actually have a look at how the pencil mark lines up with the measurement that I want to take. And when I look at something like this, because of the timber grain and the size of the pencil, my line isn't actually lining up exactly with the mark, but I can make an assessment. So on something like this, I can see that the line is slightly to this side of the 800mm mark. Only just slightly, but it's enough to be out by a few tenths of a millimetre. So what I'm going to do is make an assessment on the pencil mark that I've made on exactly where I should be cutting through. Either one side of the pencil mark, the other side of the pencil mark, or maybe straight through the middle. So on this example, I'm going to be keeping the line, and I want that blade to go down that side of the pencil line. Maybe if I'd marked a little bit further this way, I'd want to be removing the line. Or if I'd marked right in the middle, and I've done a really good job marking, then in my head I'd be thinking I want that blade to go right down the centre of the pencil line. And the only reason I know that is once I've marked, I've actually put the tape measure back on and compared my mark with the tape measure. And that's the difference between an average cut and an accurate cut. This next tip I've used twice in the last 3 videos, and after each time I've had a number of comments asking me exactly what I did there. And it's where you have to cut a piece of timber to fit nice and snug and exact into a gap or between 2 other pieces of timber. Now there's an easy and a hard way of doing it. The hard way of doing it is actually measuring the gap with the tape, adding on the thickness of the tape measure itself. Or another way of doing it is obviously marking maybe 100 or 200mm and then coming from the other direction and adding that on. That's the hard way of doing it. The easier way is actually by offering up the piece of timber into the gap and just marking where you need to cut. And let me exaggerate it for you to make it very clear, and let's use a nice thick marker. Now, if I run my marker up and down that a number of times, it's clear that we don't want to cut on this side. We don't even want to go through the middle of the mark. We need to be cutting on this side. So let's do that. I'm going to leave it a little bit long and show you how I trim it down. So that I've just cut down and it doesn't fit, and it shouldn't fit because I've actually on purpose left a little gap between the mark and the cut. So what I want to do now is to start trimming that down by very small amounts to make it fit in here. And in theory you could do it by hand using a plane, but especially if you're using ply like this, quite difficult to do. There's a technique that I use on the miter saw which is repeatable, and for every time I use it takes off about 1/3 of a millimetre, and that's what I use to get a nice tight fit. I'll show you now. So on every miter saw blade, the cutting teeth protrude wider than the blade body itself, and the difference between where this tungsten bit protrudes and the main body is around about, on my blade, 1/3 of a millimetre. So what I like to do is get the piece to be trimmed, bring down your saw without it being on, butt it up nice and gently to the blade, hold it in place, bring it up and make a cut. So what you find is every time you do this, this piece of timber is getting shorter by around about 1/3 to 1/2 a millimetre, but it's controlled. You can do it a number of times and as many times as you need. And there you have it. The perfect fit. This next one I think I'm going to have to go outside to demonstrate to you, but essentially when you're doing groundwork, so maybe you've done the excavation and you've started to bring the ground back up with like sub-base and concrete say, it's quite common to hammer in pins and stakes and have insulation tape to signify the right level that each layer comes up to. Just as an aside, if you're going to do that, the correct level should be the bottom of the tape. That means that if you're bringing some material up, you can still see the tape when it gets to the right point. If it's the top of the tape, it's the right point is you've now covered the tape and you don't know where you are. Anyway, that's just a bit of an aside. So we'd normally level the top of the pin and understand what that dimension is. And there's 2 ways of then marking and putting this tape on. The first way is to get on your hands and knees with your head on the floor bring your tape down and mark that point and then put the insulation tape on. But there's an easier way of doing it. Let me show you now. Once the pin is in the ground and you understand what the dimension is from the top of the pin to the bottom of the tape, rather than marking that on the pin, stick your insulation tape directly to your tape measure at the right position. You can then hook the tape measure on the top of the pin and transfer the insulation tape to that and take it off your tape measure, wrap it around. All you do need to do is just double check that it's at the right level, and I guarantee you 99% of the time it'll be bang on. So this next tip is for those of you that own a laser level. Now it's quite common when you've got a laser level. You can set up a horizontal beam and then measure down to the floor or the ceiling to do a bit of a survey to understand where everything is. And you can do that just by a tape measure, and wherever the beam hits the tape measure is obviously the distance. But you do need to make sure that the tape measure is vertical. And in surveying terms, the way we do that is to rock it backwards and forwards and take the lowest reading. That means it's perpendicular and it's vertical. And that can be quite difficult sometimes, especially if you're doing the ceiling and trying to read the measure and trying to keep it straight and then rocking it as well. So what I like to do is to make my own staff. I've got a little staff here. I've got a bit of timber that I've just routed out, and then I've glued in or epoxied in a tape measure that's come to the end of its life. I've made sure that the wobbly bit at the end is still moving in and out, and that means that I can move that and use it as a tape measure, but obviously it's stiff now rather than all wobbly, and I can even do it on the ceiling fairly easily. So that's my top tip. With an old tape measure, make your own staff. My last tip is actually my favourite, and this is something my dad taught me many years ago, although I've never seen anyone practice this and I've never seen it mentioned on any video, so I'm sure it's probably going to be new to you. And it's not about exact measurement, it's about approximating things but quite accurately, and it's all about knowing the size of your own hands. Now I know that my span between my thumb and my middle finger is exactly 200 millimeters or 8 inches. My dad's span was 10 inches, and I'm sure if you measure your own hand, somewhere you'll find one of your spans between your thumb and one of your fingers actually conforms to something that you can remember. Now this is really handy when you're out and about and you haven't got a tape measure, just for checking out the sizes of things and materials. I'll show you an example on the bench. So for instance, if I wanted to assess the width of this workbench, knowing this is 200, that's 2, 4, 6, 800 is hanging over the end by about 20-30 mil, so that's maybe 770 wide. Okay, it's 760, but it's pretty close. I realise now I've used it in one of my previous videos when I was cutting some cloth to fit into a planter very roughly, and even when I'm out and about at the big box stores, it comes in really useful. Rather than carrying a tape about, I can assess down to a few millimetres or maybe a quarter of an inch the size of most things on any of the shelves. So those are my top half a dozen measuring tips that I've not seen explained on any other video. Having said that, I'm sure lots of you are using something along the same lines, but maybe you've learnt something along the way. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please check out the other ones on my channel and please subscribe. So until next time, remember, 8 inches.